Thanks once again to Kevin for including me in this and putting this all together. It's a Herculean task. So my paper is about incense, or our paper. It's about the significance and use of incense in traditional Chinese religion. So first, when I've presented about this before, people have asked me, what is traditional Chinese religion? Is it Taoism? Is it Buddhism? Is it Confucianism? Well, it's a fusion of all three that I argue is pretty unique and consistent to Chinese communities, particularly in the Chinese diaspora. In China itself, it's going through a bit of a revival, but under the Cultural Revolution, a lot of these practices and beliefs were purged as superstitious. So since we're talking about feasting, I thought I'd give an example of a mythological story where you can see how these three philosophies, religions, interact with each other. This is probably the most popular mythological story story period in Chinese culture, Journey to the West, or what is often translated as the Monkey King. So a pivotal episode in this story is when the Monkey King is causing all kinds of havoc in Taoist heaven. He's offended pretty much everyone there because he's obviously violating Confucian notions of social propriety. But he's too powerful. So the Taoist gods don't really know what to do with him. So they call on the Buddhas to come and help them. So there's a meta-narrative here about the relationship between Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, how Confucianism kind of governs how people are supposed to relate to each other, but how Buddhism somehow teaches a higher or more powerful path than Taoism. Though when they sit down for the feast afterwards, after Buddha's finally tricked the Monkey King into going under a mountain for 500 years, the Buddha sits like a little bit lower than the king of Taoist heaven. So even though his power is seen as being stronger and able to contain the Monkey King, he's still considered to be somewhat lower, or maybe a guest to the king of Taoist heaven. So it kind of demonstrates this complicated relationship between Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism in Chinese religion, and how you can't really tease them apart, especially once you start looking at the mythologies and the practices of actual people. Everybody's to some degree a part of each three. So with that out of the way, I will get more into the topic of my paper, our paper. First, I take a broad look at the relationship between religion and sensation. I primarily draw from Bridget Mayer's work and David Howe's. They argue that religious studies has tended to look at the more ephemeral aspects, like belief, rather than the material aspects. So they are trying to promote a focus on the material aspects of religion. They also argue that religious experience is not something that goes above and beyond the senses, that it is actually intersensory. So it aims to engage as much of the sensory self as possible, and once the self as a whole is engaged, that's when we tend to have these religious experiences. And you can't help but note, like in the name of a vision quest, when people are having religious experiences, they often describe them using their senses. So it's not something that goes above and beyond the senses. Where am I here? I focus in this paper, because I'm looking at incense, on the sense of smell. Physiologically, smell is connected to the limbic system. It's particularly associated with memory and emotion. It's also connected to breathing, heart rate, and hormonal balance. In English, we have no direct descriptors for scent, so we often refer to the object that's emitting the smell, like it smells fishy, or we refer to descriptors from taste, so it smells sweet. And smell can be highly idiosyncratic, yet also indicative of a communal experience. And the example I give here is my own personal experience with curry, because I grew up in Mill Woods, a suburb of Edmonton that has a lot of Pakistani people. So when I was growing up, This smell was something that was foreign, it was associated with otherness, it was disgusting. But then when I started to travel, I figured, oh, I'm going to try curry out, why not? And I fell in love with it, and then I lived in Taiwan for 2.5 years, and the smell of curry would actually instigate bouts of homesickness. So you can see how one person's relationship to the smell, because of their own memories and emotions associated to it, can change over time. So a general history of incense, and I would love if you could correct me about the early Christianity stuff. I only had one source on that, so if there's anything you have to add, that would be great. Generally, it was used to mask the smell of burning flesh at funerals to start. Egyptians and Romans eventually believed that gods favored certain scents, that their presence or absence can be detected through smell. Early Christians banned the use of incense because they associated it with idolatry, with paganism, but eventually, as the three kings gave incense to Jesus, they came to accept it and use it in their own practice, and Christian saints were said to emit a sweet odor. Sweetness in particular is associated with divinity in many cultures, and I just read an article recently in National Geographic about sweetness and bitterness, and how there's an evolutionary element to it, and how bitterness was associated with things that were poisonous, sweetness was something that was edible, and so this has kind of evolved, and we piled all kinds of layers of meaning on top of that. But not being materially reductionist. Now some people love eating bitter things, and it's not because they're poisonous, so it's a lot more complicated. The history of incense in China, before 200 BC, and this is where I kind of get into food, they didn't have incense. They burned grains, vegetables, fragrant flowers, and animal oils. So they were offering a feast to their gods. And the word for incense is a combination of the word for sweet, or the character for incense, gan, and the character for grain. So maybe here we kind of get into the bread again. People are offering grains, maybe not exactly bread, but something used to make bread. The first recorded instance of incense use was around 200 BC, and it intensified with the introduction of Buddhism to China, mostly during the Han Dynasty. There's even further association with food because they developed a specific vessel for burning incense, and this vessel was modeled on a cooking pot. The word for incense burner is a combination of the word for incense and the word for cooking pot. So, and this cooking pot became, like, socially, it's very important. I don't know if it still is now, but before the communist revolution, these incense burners, and they're still really important in diasporic communities, they're indicative of a social unit, because tons of different kinds of voluntary associations are founded on these incense burners. And the incense burners and their associations acted as a balance for imperial hierarchy. So some local disputes sometimes wouldn't even go to the imperial authorities. They would just be worked out in these incense burner associations. And they weren't just religious. Even the word religion is fairly new to China and Chinese language. Maybe 150 years ago they finally adopted a word from Japanese, because religion was pretty diffuse through all of society. Now, traditional Chinese use of incense. It is lit at the start of any ritual, so it doesn't matter how big or small the ritual is, incense is necessary. And it's because they believe that the gods, most of whom used to be living people, they retain their senses even once they become deified. So the smell of incense is what attracts their attention to the petitioners. So without that smell of incense, they don't have the attention of the god, and therefore the ritual is just an act without any what they would call ling. Ling is the efficacy or potency of a god. When you ask worshippers about it, they refer to the miracles it's performed, the overall prosperity of the temple, number of worshippers it has, and incense is used to transfer the god's ling to objects and people and such, usually by passing it through smoke 3 times. Other uses of incense include to repel and avoid harmful spirits, to expel plagues, to call back lost souls, purify from spiritual pollution, to enhance health, and I believe we kind of talked about this earlier in relation to food. So in Chinese incense, they use a lot of the same herbs from medicine. So incense is considered to be a type of medicine. But all these uses are not necessarily unique to Chinese culture. Many of these could be said of sage in Aboriginal culture. What is unique to traditional Chinese culture is the role that incense plays in pilgrimage and processions. So Taoist temples in particular, and shrines, are founded with the incense ash of another temple. Ancestral altars at home are also founded with the incense ash of other family altars. So anytime, particularly a male wants to leave home and start a new household, he'll take the incense ash from his house altar and start a new altar in his new home. This is called either dividing the incense fire or dividing the family. And at pilgrimages, not all of them, but I would say most, if not many of them, are a retracing of this incense genealogy. So daughter temples will go back to their mother temples to renew the ling of their idol. Sometimes sister temples will go visit each other, and the way that they use incense will indicate what the relationship is between the 2 temples. And then once going back again into the actual terminology, a pilgrim is called literally translated as incense traveler, and a pilgrimage is to receive incense or to cut incense. Yeah, in general, Chinese characters play a huge role, especially with their different meanings. I've been told, I can't think of any exact example of this, but I've been told that a lot of the food that they eat at Chinese New Year, you eat certain things because the word for that food is, with a different tone, means prosperity or long life, or so there's a whole lot of using the different meanings of characters and words and the tones to instill meaning into what you're eating. So, conclusions. Just to focus on the role of sensation in religious practice and belief. Also, I wanted to emphasize how memory and emotion are associated with the sense of smell. So when we smell something, like when I smell incense that comes from the type of incense that I smelled in China, I immediately recall all the, God's birthday party crashing that I did when I lived there for 2.5 years. I was just that strange white guy who happened to know where all the best parties were, and southern Taiwan is southern Taiwan, Tainan, which is where I lived, is a very, very active. Like I kind of know what you're talking about coming to Edmonton, and it just seems kind of flat. Like there, it was like every other day there was fireworks, and I was having to go a different way to work every other day because there was a festival in the streets, and stop at a red light, a couple cars go by, a couple dancing Taoist gods, followed by a truck full of drums. It's just constant. So here it's just so quiet, so private too. I miss it. So in Taoism and traditional Chinese religion in general, incense is central to communicating with the deity, vocabulary related to religion, the propagation of a deity, and motivation for pilgrimage. So incense becomes a very material objectification of immaterial forces, and acts as a bridge between the visible and the invisible worlds.